Hi guys, I've been asked a few times by message, email and in the comments to my videos to talk a bit about fighting against multiple opponents. Now there's quite a few things, it's quite a big topic actually, but just to give a little overview, so the historical fencing treatises, not many of them actually really talk much about fighting multiple opponents. The focus in most treatises is on one-on-one fighting with similar weapons. Okay, so fighting with mismatched weapons or fighting against numerous opponents is not really touched upon very much. However, it is touched upon here and there. Okay, so for example, Filippo Vardi in 1480s says when fighting multiple opponents, don't thrust, but keep cutting instead. Okay. Interestingly, De Grassi says a similar thing in the 16th century with a big two-handed sword. Says that basically when you're fighting one-on-one, rely on the point. When you're fighting multiple opponents, cut all around you. This perhaps connects also to the Portuguese and Spanish montante material. Montante is also a big two-handed sword, but a sort of Iberian style one. And that seems to focus on a lot of solo movements, that you're swinging the weapon around, changing direction as if you're fighting multiple opponents. And this is one of the possible uses, of course, of the large two-handed sword. It seems to have been used by bodyguards or indeed by people who were set to defend a given position, like a gateway or a bridge, or the flank of a unit, in fact. Okay. So the two-handed weapon and perhaps halberds and bills, these kind of polearms that have a good cutting capacity to them, seem to have been perhaps deployed against multiple opponents to keep multiple opponents at bay or dish out some wounds and prevent these people coming in close. In terms of standard sidearms, smaller swords and such like, there are some, it is touched upon here and there in various treatises in various periods. For example, Hans Talhofer shows a guy with a sword and buckler. I believe he's got a dagger in the buckler hand as well, so he's got buckler and dagger in the left hand, a bit like a Highlander who used a Taj and a dirk in the left hand. And he has a sword in the other hand, and he seems to be fighting two opponents who are either side of him. And indeed it is mentioned in passing in later sabre sources, in fact, that teaching the moulinette movement, that is the, just grab a sword, we take a sword here, so moving the sword in arcs and moving around, it's done primarily as a sort of wrist exercise and a way of training the cuts to get more fluid. But it's also mentioned that fighting against multiple opponents, or indeed fighting at night, this can be useful because you keep the weapon moving and going around. And it's very interesting, this continuity. I don't think there's a conscious continuity or a known continuity, but it clearly seems to be a logical conclusion to what do you do if you have to fight either at night, where you can't really see what your opponent or opponents are doing, or equally if you have to fight multiple opponents where you can't really rely on your eyes that much either, because you can't always see what your multiple opponents are individually doing. And it's interesting as well that if you look at Indian martial arts, if you look at Gapka for example, one of the explanations for a lot of, they have very similar moulinette drills, is that it's for fighting multiple opponents, and they do a lot of this continuous circling motion whilst turning around with a tulwar or a tulwar and buckler, and it's possible that's partly for the same reason as well. So there is material out there on fighting multiple opponents, and we do know from history that some individuals did successfully fight multiple opponents and defeat them and survive. I've pulled out one random example. There's many examples in this Swordsman of the British Empire, which is by D.A. Kinsley. It's available on Lulu Books. and I contributed the introduction to it. But I've just pulled out a random example from the Crimean War, from the charge of the Light Brigade. This is an account from Private John Doyle of the 8th Hussars. Okay? He says, there were from 40 to 50 Russians after or around one man. I can answer for myself that there was a large number around me. As they were galloping nearly one on top of another to see who would have me first, I must have wounded many of them, as I did nothing but parry their points and return my own as quickly as I could. There was an officer who dashed into the centre of us when the Russian lancers came down on our left and wounded a man named Kennedy. He took the skin off one side of his head. He had also wounded or killed several others, but I could not say how many. I had pointed him, that means thrust him, with a right rear point, and just as the Russian retreat sounded, I saw the same officer endeavouring to get in front of me. When he heard the sound, he turned short to the left and met me right hand to right hand, and made a terrible point at me. But I had my eye on him, for I knew I had pointed him in the rear of the guns, and he would have me if he could. But, thank God, I was too quick for him. I parried off his point, and with a return point drove my sword through his mouth. I still kept on the swing and saw nothing more of him. When I got back, no one knew me, for I was covered in blood from head to foot. And that's from a descriptive account of the famous charge of the Light Brigade, written in 1877. So there's just one example from the charge of the Light Brigade, but obviously in war it happens many times that the opponents are not of equal number. Sometimes there's 3 guys versus 5 guys, sometimes there's 4 guys versus 7 guys. It's just the way it will happen in any one moment. In a chaotic melee, it will happen all the time that one group or one individual will be outnumbered by another group or of people. So it is obviously a real aspect of martial arts, obviously of any martial arts, and something to be borne in mind with sword training. And you know, I have a friend, Mark Gilbert, who particularly focuses, for any of you who go to fight camp, you'll know Mark. He runs the melee games, and he also does very, very well in one-on-one tournaments. And we're actually having a melee tournament at fight camp this year. And it'll be an interesting thing because there'll be small teams, it will be equal numbers. But even when you start off as equal numbers, very quickly, as soon as one team loses a fighter, okay, to being hit, suddenly the other side's outnumbered. And that can massively change, it can very rapidly change how the fight's going. If 5 are fighting 5, and suddenly it becomes 5 versus 4 or 5 versus 3, that 3 or 4 really struggle very quickly to hold their own. However, sometimes, and I've seen this many times, you get one good fighter or perhaps 2 people who work very well together in a team, and they can decimate a team of 5 people. So it's an interesting thing, and fighting in groups and fighting against groups is definitely a skill set which is quite particular and requires quite different mindset to fighting one against one. And I know many people who are awesome fighters one-on-one who are useless as soon as they're faced against 2 opponents, or indeed if they're part of a team against an equal-sized team, because fighting in a team is very different to fighting as an individual. If you don't protect the guys who are fighting with you, if they get knocked out, suddenly you find that, you know, if you're just fighting for yourself, suddenly you find that it's you against 5 guys because all your teammates have been killed because you weren't protecting them and looking for their back. Then it's you against 5 people, and you really stand very little chance unless you're amazing or they're very bad. And last thing I would say is fighting in groups and fighting multiple opponents, a lot of it is about tactics of the moment, like hitting the guy who's not looking at you because he's trying to hit your friend. Okay? Not necessarily focusing on the guy who's in front of you, but focusing on the guy there or the guy there, or making sure that there isn't something running around to get around you here. Okay, so it's a completely different mindset to fighting 1 versus 1. I hope that's an okay introduction to the topic. Undoubtedly I'll talk some more about this in the future. Cheers!